You never forget the taste of your first proper army ration, mostly because you spend the next 4 years trying to forget every single one that comes after it. I was a kid, really, still thinking with my stomach, and I remember the metallic screech of the can opener biting into the lid, that faint puff of air that always smelled like the inside of a machine shop. And then, disappointment. It was always a disappointment. A lump of cold, greasy meat swimming in a congealed fat that clung to the roof of your mouth. We called it Old Man, or sometimes worse, names I won't repeat, this greyish-pink mystery that was supposed to be pork or beef, but tasted only of salt and despair. You'd look at it in your mess tin, this sad little pool of sustenance, and you'd think, this is what we're fighting for. But then your belly would growl, a real, honest sound in the unnatural quiet of a lull in the fighting, and you'd shovel it in, because the calories were the only thing keeping you alive, keeping your fingers from shaking when you had to thread a needle to sew up a boy who'd caught a piece of shrapnel. We got creative. You had to. A little stolen onion, a clove of garlic traded from a French farmer who looked at you with eyes full of ancient hatred, could transform that greasy mess into something almost palatable. But the real currency wasn't food, not really. It was flavor. A single cube of real chocolate, the dark, bitter kind, could be worth a week's worth of cigarettes. Coffee, real coffee, not that roasted barley chicory substitute that tasted like burnt dirt. A handful of those beans were more valuable than a general's promise. I once saw a man trade his last pair of dry socks for a small tin of instant. Dry socks, in the mud of autumn Russia. That's how much a taste of warmth, a taste of normality, meant to us. You de-huddle over your tiny stove, the one we all carried, a pathetic little flame that was more hope than heat, and you brew that coffee so carefully, measuring each precious grain, and the smell, the smell would travel through the whole dugout. And for a few minutes, we weren't soldiers in a freezing hole, we were just men sharing a pot of coffee, and the war outside the tarpaulin flap ceased to exist. That's what it was all about, really. The rituals. The army could give us the rations, but it was the rituals that made them mean something. The shared mess tin, the one we'd pass around when someone had managed to heat up a stew, it wasn't just a pot, it was a dinner table. It was the closest thing we had to a family. You'd sit there, your knees touching the guy next to you, the steam from the food warming your faces, and you'd talk. Not about the war, never about the war if you could help it. You'd talk about the girls back home, the ones whose photos were frayed at the edges from being handled so much. You talk about your mother's apple strudel, or the way your father's workshop smelled of sawdust and oil. And you'd eat, slowly, making it last, each spoonful a tiny rebellion against the chaos outside. But that little flame, that beacon of comfort, was also a death sentence. The smell of cooking food could carry for miles on a still evening, a siren's call for enemy artillery spotters or a roaming patrol. I remember one evening, it must have been near Smolensk, we had a real treat, a rabbit one of the boys had snared. We had it bubbling in a pot. The smell was divine, like heaven itself had descended into our muddy trench. And then we heard it, the faint, whispering whistle of a mortar shell. We scattered, diving into the slime, and the blast threw dirt and rocks and what was left of our rabbit stew all over us. We lost our dinner, but we didn't lose a man. We lay there in the mud, covered in broth, and we started laughing. A crazy, hysterical laughter that was halfway to tears. The absurdity of it, to be almost killed by a pot of stew. But that was the silent agreement we all lived by. We shared everything. A full stomach meant a focused mind, and a focused mind might just keep you alive long enough to see the next sunrise. If a guy from Bavaria had a parcel from home with some good sausage, he'd break it off for the boy from Hamburg who'd been quiet for 2 days, staring at nothing. You didn't ask, you just shared. It was the only law that mattered, and the tastes, they were more than just fuel. They were time machines. I remember one time we managed to get our hands on some black bread. Real, heavy, sour black bread, the kind that could break a window pane if you threw it hard enough. I bit into it, the crust cracking against my teeth, and I was gone. I was 10 years old again, sitting in my mother's kitchen in my village outside Dresden. The morning sun was streaming through the window, catching the dust motes in the air. I could smell the yeast from the bakery down the street. I could hear the clatter of her pots, the sound of my father's boots on the cobblestones outside. For a split second, the war vanished. There was no screaming metal, no smell of cordite and blood, no bone-deep cold. There was just the taste of that bread and the warmth of a home I feared I'd never see again. And then the moment passed, and I was back in the frozen hell of Russia, with the taste of childhood on my tongue and tears stinging my eyes. We all had those triggers. The letters from home were the worst for it, or the best, depending on the day. My mother would write pages and pages, and always, she would describe the meals. We had a roast goose on Sunday, Carl, with potatoes and red cabbage, just like you like. The skin was so crisp, and the applesauce was from the Jonathans in the orchard. I would read those lines aloud to the men in my unit, my voice barely a whisper, and you could see it in their faces. They weren't hearing my words anymore. They were at their own tables with their own families. We were a group of hollow-eyed, exhausted men, sitting in a dugout that stank of wet wool and unwashed bodies, but for those few minutes we were feasting. The contrast was sometimes too much to bear. I remember one Christmas. We'd been issued a special holiday ration, a slightly better grade of canned meat, a few biscuits, and a tiny, rock-hard fruitcake. The fighting had been brutal, and our unit was scattered. I found myself alone in a forward observation post, a shallow scrape in the ground with a frozen blanket pulled over my head. I ate that holiday meal alone, the fruitcake tasting like sweetened brick, and I listened to the crump of artillery in the distance, a grotesque substitute for church bells. The profound sadness that washed over me was a physical weight. I was thousands of miles from home, sitting in mud that was frozen solid, eating a pathetic imitation of a feast, and I felt more alone than I have ever felt in my life, before or since. That's when you realized that the real hunger wasn't in your stomach, it was in your soul. But you carried things with you that weren't issued, things that were worth more than any weapon. I had a small leather pouch, no bigger than my thumb, tied on a string around my neck. Inside was salt. Not army salt, but coarse grey salt from a mine near my village. My grandmother had given it to me, a silly superstition for good luck. I used it sparingly, only on the most special occasions, like when we actually had a fresh potato to boil. A few crystals sprinkled on top, and it was a taste of my mountains, a taste of the earth I came from. It was a tiny anchor to a world that made sense. Then there was the candy, not from my family, but from a care package. We get them sometimes, crates marked from the German Red Cross, or from some women's league, filled with socks, scarves, and sometimes, if the guards were smiling, candy. This one piece I saved. It was a hard fruit drop, wrapped in a twist of wax paper. Red, I put it in the very bottom of my medical kit, tucked away where the bandages and the morphine lived. I told myself I would save it for a moment of true despair, for a time when I thought I couldn't go on. That moment came during the retreat. It was chaos. The roads were choked with walking wounded, with broken-down vehicles, with a river of grey-green misery flowing west. The cold was unimaginable, a living thing that clawed at your lungs and made the tears freeze on your cheeks. I had been awake for 2 days, tending to men whose wounds froze before the blood could even soak through the bandages. My fingers were numb, my feet were blocks of ice, and a deep, chilling exhaustion had seeped into my very bones. I found a moment of shelter behind a burnt-out T-34 tank, the metal still warm to the touch, a grim sort of comfort, and I remembered the candy. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open my kit. I finally got the little paper twist out, my fingers fumbling like a drunkard's. I unwrapped it and put the candy in my mouth. It was just sugar and artificial cherry flavor, but as it dissolved on my tongue, a slow, sweet warmth spread through me. It was a tiny, defiant spark of life in the overwhelming darkness. It didn't change anything. The cold was still there, the retreat was still a nightmare, men were still dying. But for those few minutes, as I sucked on that worthless piece of candy, I felt human again. I felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear or fatigue. It was hope. A small, fragile, stupid hope, but it was enough. It was enough to make me get up, sling my bag over my shoulder, and stumble on down that frozen road, looking for the next man who needed my help. Because that's what we did. We found comfort where we could, we shared what we had, and we carried the taste of home in a tin can or a pouch of salt or a piece of candy, because those were the things that reminded us what we were fighting to get back to. Not for glory, not for the fatherland, but for a warm kitchen and a family, and a life where a meal was more than just something to keep you from starving. You want to know what it was really like? Not the maps with the big arrows, not the newsreels with the marching and the flags. I'll tell you. It was the cold. That's what I remember first. A cold that got into your bones and stayed there like you'd never be warm again. This was Russia, winter of '42, and the world had just turned to white and grey and this dirty brown slush. We were dug in along this frozen creek bed, and they were dug in maybe 200, 300 meters away on the other side of a field of stubble poking up through the snow. And for weeks nothing moved. The big attack had stalled and we were just there, waiting. And in that waiting you start to hear things. Not the shells, thank God, but the other sounds. The sounds of another man's life happening just a stone's throw away. You'd hear one of them cough, a wet, rattling cough that carried clean across the silence, and you'd think, well, he's got the same crud in his lungs as Carl over here. Or late in the evening, a burst of laughter would drift over, rough and deep, and you wonder what joke they could possibly be telling in the middle of this hell. Once, just once, one of them sang. A low, sad folk song, the kind my own Oma might have hummed. The words were different, of course, but the melody was about missing home. Everyone knows that melody. You didn't need a translator for that. And in that eerie quiet, you'd sit in your hole, your breath smoking in the air, and you'd realize the most terrifying and simple thing of all. The men in that other trench, the ones we were supposed to hate, the subhuman Bolsheviks, the political officers ranted about, they were just as cold as we were, just as scared, just as tired. They were just men, trying to get through another hour, another night, just like us. Their feet were probably just as frozen, their bellies just as empty, their thoughts drifting back to some village, some woman, some warm kitchen, just like ours were. That's a dangerous thought to have, you know. It's easier to kill a monster than a man who misses his mother. And then there were the glimmers, the little flashes where that understanding broke through the surface. They were fragile things, like finding a single green leaf in all that frozen mud. One evening, a harmonica started up from their side. A simple tune, but clear. One of our boys' hands, he was a musician before all this, he perked up. He fumbled in his pack, pulled out his own harmonica, and after a moment's hesitation, he played the same tune back. Just a few bars. The music from their side stopped. For a heartbeat there was nothing, and we all held our breath, thinking maybe we'd provoked something. Then the Soviet soldier played another phrase, a question. Hands answered. Back and forth it went, this silent conversation across no man's land, a language everyone understood. Nobody shot. Nobody shouted. We just listened. That was the first unspoken truce. Then there were the cigarettes. We had decent tobacco. They had that rough Mackhawker stuff that smelled like burnt leaves. Sometimes a tin would come arcing out of their trench, landing halfway between the lines. A gesture of insane trust. One of us would scramble out, heart pounding, expecting a sniper's bullet any second, grab it, and toss a tin of ours back. It was like children trading marbles, but with your life on the line. The shared frustration was the strongest bond of all. You'd curse the knee-deep mud that sucked the boots right off your feet, and you could damn well hear them cursing it over there too. The rats, big as cats, they didn't care which uniform you wore. They were a common enemy. And the officers. We were all united in our quiet loathing for the officers, ours and theirs, sitting warm miles behind the line, moving us around on their maps like we were toy soldiers, never having to smell the latrines or feel the fear curdling in their guts. We were all just pawns in the same miserable game. But the real test, the thing that carved a groove in your soul, was the compassion. I was a medic, a sanitäter. My job was to patch men up, to stop the bleeding, to ease the pain, regardless of rank or company. But the orders were clear, our men first. The enemy was to be left. But how do you do that? How do you look at a boy, and he was always just a boy, lying out there in the snow, his leg bent all wrong, crying out for his mother in a language you don't understand, but the pain in his voice is a language you understand perfectly. I remember one time, it was after a small, stupid skirmish, a patrol that went wrong. The shooting stopped, and the silence was broken by this low, animal-like moaning from no man's land. A Soviet soldier, maybe 17, was writhing in a shell hole. He'd been there for hours. I could see him from my position. My lieutenant, a decent fellow for an officer, saw me looking. "Forget it, Schmidt," he said, his voice tired. "He's not one of ours. It's a trick, or it's not our problem." But the crying didn't stop. It got into my head. It was a cold so deep you could feel it in your teeth. That boy would freeze to death by morning if his wounds didn't kill him first. I made a decision. I slung my bag over my shoulder, the red cross facing forward, and I just started walking. I didn't ask permission. I just went. I could feel the eyes from our trench on my back, and I imagined the eyes from their trench squinting down rifle sights. Every step was a lifetime. The snow crunched under my boots, the only sound in the world besides that crying. I reached him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror, seeing the enemy uniform. He tried to scrabble away, whimpering. I knelt down, showed him my empty hands, then my bag. I said, "Sanitäter, medic." I don't know if he understood the word, but he understood the tone. I gave him a shot of morphine, and as it took effect, the fear in his eyes softened into a drowsy confusion. I splinted his leg as best I could, packed the wound, gave him a sip of water from my canteen. I left him there, but I made sure I was visible. I stood up, looked toward the Soviet lines, and pointed at the boy. I hoped someone over there was watching. I walked back to my trench, my knees shaking. Not a single shot was fired. That was another truce. There were others, smaller ones. An unspoken rule not to shoot a man while he was taking a piss. You'd see a guy climb out of the opposite trench, rifle left behind, and do his business, and you'd just look away. It was a basic human dignity. But these small acts, they cost you. They made the abstraction of the enemy into a person. And that made it so much harder later, when the madness started again. It's easy to shoot at a shadow. It's a hell of a thing to shoot at a man you just heard whistling a tune you know. The end of the stalemate came like a fist to the gut. It started with the sound we all dreaded most. The distant, deep-throated rumble of our own artillery way behind us. That was the signal. The waiting was over. My stomach just sank. It was a physical feeling, a heavy, cold rock settling inside me. You look across that field, at the trench where you'd just seen a man stretching his arms to the sky that morning, and you knew you were going to have to run toward it, through the mud and the wire, and the men you had to kill were no longer faceless. They had coughs and they laughed, and they shared their tobacco. The barrage began, shells screaming overhead to tear their world apart. Then the whistles, the lieutenants and sergeants blowing their whistles, the sound that meant go over the top. And you go. You haul yourself out of the relative safety of your hole, your heart hammering against your ribs, and you run forward into the chaos. The machine guns start up, that terrifying BRRRRP sound, and men around you start falling. You're running right towards the source of that harmonica music. You see a muzzle flash from a rifle port, and you fire back, not at a Soviet soldier, not at an Ivan, but at the man who might have tossed you a cigarette. That's the true horror of it. The army, the war machine, it doesn't want you to think of them as men. It can't function if you do. It needs monsters to fight. And we had to become monsters again, for a little while, to survive. But you carry the memory of those quiet moments. You carry them like a heavy secret, a shameful, beautiful secret. Long after the war ended, long after I came home to a different world, I'd hear a particular tune on a harmonica or smell a certain type of rough tobacco, and I'd be back there. I'd see the face of that young boy in the snow, and I'd wonder if he lived. I'd wonder about the man who played the music. We were enemies, by all the definitions that mattered. We were trying to kill each other. But for a few brief, stolen moments in all that insanity, we were just human beings, recognizing the same humanity in each other. And maybe, in the end, that was the only thing that kept any of us from going completely, utterly mad. That's the war they don't put in the history books. That's the war I remember. You want to know what we carried? The sergeant, he saw what we carried. He'd come by for inspection, all polished boots and that look that could strip paint, and he'd see a clean rifle, a full ammo pouch, a helmet without a scratch he could yell about. He saw the soldier, but he never saw the man. What kept a man going, what kept him from becoming just another hollow-eyed ghost in a uniform that was all tucked away, hidden like contraband? For me, it was in the inner lining of my tunic, right over my heart, a small, secret pocket I'd sewn myself by the flickering light of a candle in some bombed-out French farmhouse. Inside that pocket was the whole of my life before all this madness, the weight of it somehow keeping me anchored, stopping me from just floating away into the screaming chaos. And I was always afraid, a low-grade, constant buzz like a distant mosquito, that he'd find it. That he'd pull out those few precious things and hold them up for the whole unit to see, and the laughter, The mocking look at the sentimental fool thinks this is a picnic would have been worse than any punishment detail. You didn't show weakness, you see. You couldn't afford to. But what they called weakness, I called my soul. So, let me tell you about the inventory of my soul, the things that had more weight than all the ammunition in my pouches. First, the photograph. Most of the boys, they had a picture of a sweetheart, a girl back home with smiling eyes and promises on her lips. Not me. I had a photograph of my sister, Anna. It was a silly thing, really, taken the summer before I left. She had her head thrown back, laughing at something I'd said, and the sun was catching the freckles across her nose. Her smile wasn't a promise of something future. It was a memory of something real, something pure. My girlfriend's smile was full of tears and goodbyes, and looking at it just made me ache with a loneliness so deep I could taste it, like cold metal. But Anna's smile, that was the smile from before. That was the smile from when we were kids stealing apples from old man Fisher's orchard. That smile was courage. It was a reminder of a world where joy existed without a soundtrack of artillery. Then there was the stone. Just a simple, smooth river stone, grey and flat, about the size of a mark coin. My son, Klaus, he was only 4 when I left. He pressed it into my hand at the train station, his little face all serious. "For luck, Papa," he whispered, and then the tears came and he buried his face in his mother's coat. That stone was worn smooth, not by the river, but by his small, worried hands. He'd carried it in his pocket for a week before I shipped out, he told me, to make it lucky. And the last thing, well, that wasn't a thing you could hold, but I carried it all the same. It was the letter, the unfinished letter to my parents. I must have written it 100 times in my head, lying in muddy holes with rain dripping down my neck, or trying to sleep to the rumble of our own guns. I knew every word, the opening, the hope that they were well, the questions about the neighbors, the dog. But I could never get past the middle. How do you describe this? How do you tell them about the smell of cordite and decay that gets in your clothes and never leaves, about the sound a man makes when he's hit, a sound that's nothing like in the movies, about the hollow feeling in your gut that isn't hunger but just emptiness? The words wouldn't come onto paper. They'd just swirl in my head and die. So the letter remained unfinished, a ghost in my pocket. And we had our rituals, our little superstitions. They were as important as cleaning your rifle. Before we'd go over the top, when the lieutenant would give the signal and your heart would try to hammer its way out of your chest, I'd press my back against the trench wall, the dirt crumbling under my fingers, and I'd slip my hand inside my tunic. Nobody was watching. Every man was in his own private hell in those last moments. I'd find the photograph, and with my thumb, my nail edged with grime no amount of washing could remove, I'd trace the outline of Anna's face. I'd focus on that smile, trying to burn it into my mind, a shield against what was coming. It was a silent prayer. Then I'd feel for the stone, cold and solid. I'd curl my fingers around it, squeeze it until I could feel its shape impressed into my palm. On watch during the long, fearful nights, that stone was my anchor. The darkness out in No-Man's-Land was alive, every rustle a creeping enemy, every shadow a sniper. The cold would seep into your bones, a damp chill that made your teeth chatter. But that stone in my hand, it was a different kind of cold. It was the cold of the river near my home, a clean, honest cold. Holding it, I could almost hear the water and Klaus's laughter. It was a superstition, a crazy one, but we were all crazy in our own ways. I truly believed, deep down in a place beyond reason, that if I lost those items, I would lose myself. Man known as Hans, the brother, the son, the father would disappear, and only the soldier would remain, a numb, empty thing that just followed orders until it stopped. Those objects were the proof that I had once been a human being. The fear, the constant companion, wasn't just the fear of death. That was a big, shapeless monster you tried not to look at directly. No, there was a more specific, more intimate fear. The fear of those items being sent home without me. We all knew the drill. We'd seen it happen. A man falls, and if you're lucky, if there's a lull in the fighting, you gather his things, his paybook, his identification tags, and the personal effects. You'd stuff them into his helmet, and that helmet, with his name scrawled in white paint on the inside rim, would begin the long, lonely journey back to a family that was about to have their world shattered. I hated that practice. I hated writing my name inside my helmet. It felt like signing your own death warrant, like inviting the fate. But you did it. Everyone did it. I had a friend, Erich, a skinny kid from Hamburg with a talent for scrounging up coffee when there was none to be had. We made a promise, one night sharing a cigarette, the glow lighting up our tired faces. We promised each other that if one of us bought it, the other would make sure the personal effects, the real stuff, the stuff from the secret pocket made it home. Not just the official things, but the photograph, the stone. We shook on it, a solemn pact. Don't let them just send the helmet, Erich, I remember saying, my voice rough. Make sure they get the rest. Make sure Klaus gets his stone back. He nodded, his young-old eyes serious. You too, Hans. You make sure they get my Liesel's letters. And that was that. After he was gone, blown to pieces by a mortar round near Kiev, I had to keep that promise. It was the hardest thing I ever had to mail. Those small, silent objects in my pocket, they became more than mementos. They became my will and testament. They were the only things connecting me to the person I was before the war, the person I desperately hoped to be again. They were a tether thrown across an ocean of blood and fire, a thin, fragile line back to sanity, back to home. And on the worst days, when the screaming of the wounded rose up from the craters and the mud was thick with despair, I'd cling to that tether with everything I had, praying it wouldn't snap. That's the thing they never tell you. The war isn't just fought with rifles and tanks. It's fought in here, in the quiet moments, with the weight of a smooth stone in your palm. It's the crushing weight of memory against the terrifying emptiness of the present. You learn to move like a machine, to shoot, to take cover, to obey. But inside, you're just a scared kid holding onto a photograph for dear life, trying to remember the sound of your sister's laugh over the roar of the cannons. You become a museum of a normal life, a curator of your own past, and you pray to God you survive to reopen the doors to the public. Because if you don't, all that's left is a helmet with a name painted inside, and a few sad little items in a box, telling a story that words could never fully explain. You know, they make movies about the war, and it's all shouting and charging and the big stuff. They don't ever tell you about the waiting. That's the real war, right there. The silence between the shelling. That's where you lived, that's where you lost your mind, piece by piece. It was this awful, heavy quiet that could crush you if you let it. The fear during an attack, that's a sharp, hot thing. It's immediate. But the boredom was a cold, damp chill that got right into your bones. It was a different kind of torture. You'd be sitting in that foxhole, water seeping through your boots, and you'd just wait. You'd count the cracks in the dirt wall in front of you. You'd count the clouds, if you could see any piece of sky through the smoke haze. You'd count the number of times the guy next to you sniffled. Anything to keep your brain from turning inward, from thinking about home, from thinking about how damn scared you were. Sleep. Forget it. Oh, you doze off sometimes, but it wasn't rest. It was just your body shutting down for a few minutes, your mind still running, still listening for the sound that would mean it was starting again. Your nerves were always stretched tight, like a piano wire. A twig snapping could make you jump out of your skin. You'd hear a lark singing somewhere, this beautiful, normal sound, and it would feel like a cruel joke. How could there be birds here? How could life just go on like that when ours had stopped completely? So you had to find ways to stay sane. You invented little games, stupid things, just to pass the time. Me and my buddy Mikey, we found a flat piece of wood and some spent cartridge casings. And some German brass that was a different shape. We scratched a checkerboard into the mud with a bayonet, and we'd play for hours. The pieces were always getting stuck, and the board would wash away in the rain, and we'd just start over. We'd argue about the rules, about baseball scores from 41, before any of us had shipped out. Arguing about whether DiMaggio would keep his streak going, knowing full well the streak had ended ages ago, but it didn't matter. It was just about having a conversation about something, anything, that wasn't the war. I remember one time, a new kid joined the unit, a replacement they called him, fresh-faced kid who couldn't have been more than 18. He was shaking like a leaf, just terrified. Old Sergeant Miller, who had a face like a worn-out leather boot, sat down with him and pulled out his knife and a little block of wood. He didn't say a word about being scared. He just started teaching the kid how to whittle. Now you see the grain here, son. You gotta go with it, not against it. And for an hour, they just focused on that piece of wood, on the simple act of making a few shavings curl up. The kid's hands stopped shaking. That was the point. It wasn't about making a masterpiece. It was about making your hands do something normal, something that didn't involve a rifle. That was a kind of medicine you couldn't get in a first aid kit. And then there were the silences you shared with the other guys. You could sit shoulder to shoulder with a man for hours, not saying a single word, and you'd understand everything about what he was feeling. You'd hear him breathe, and that sound, that simple in and out, was a comfort. It meant you weren't alone in that hole. You weren't the only one waiting for the axe to fall. We did share a cigarette, not because we needed the nicotine so bad, though we did, but because it was a ritual. You'd take a deep drag, feel the smoke burn your lungs, and then you'd pass it over. The next guy would do the same. That cigarette was a tiny, glowing clock measuring out a moment of peace we all shared. You'd look at the guy's face in the flicker of the match, see the grime and the stubble and the tiredness around his eyes, and you knew he was seeing the same thing in you. You were all in this together. You'd talk about home, but in little pieces, not big stories. You'd say, "My mom makes the best apple pie," and then you'd stop, because if you kept going, you'd start to smell it, you'd see the kitchen table, and the pain of missing it would be too much. So you'd just leave it at that. "Yeah, mine too," the other guy would say, and that was enough. We all understood. We were all just boys pretending to be men, trying to remember what a normal life felt like. But underneath it all, every single second was the dread. The waiting had an end, and we all knew what it was. You could feel it coming. The silence would change. It wouldn't be quiet anymore. It would become heavy, pregnant, like the air before a thunderstorm. The joking would stop. The card games would be put away. The silence would get so thick you felt like you could chew it. That's when you'd see it all down the line. Without a word being spoken, every man would subtly check his weapon. It was a silent chorus. You'd hear the soft, metallic click of a bolt being pulled back just an inch, making sure a round was chambered, then pushed forward again. Click, 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 all up and down the trench. The sound of old metal, a deadly little song. You'd check your own rifle, your hands moving by rote, your mouth going dry as dust. You'd tighten the strap on your helmet, a useless gesture, but it was something to do. You'd look at the faces of the men around you. Their eyes would be fixed on the field of fire ahead, but they weren't really seeing it. They were looking inward, saying whatever private prayer they had, thinking of whoever they had back home. Their faces would go blank, like they were putting on a mask. And then, just before it started, there was this moment. A collective, deep breath, as if we were all one animal, taking one last gulp of air before diving into the abyss. You'd hold it, and then, from far down the line, you'd hear it. The shrill, terrifying sound of the whistle, and the world would just explode. The silence was over, and in a strange, awful way, the waiting was too. The terror had finally arrived, and in its own way it was almost a relief, because the silence was gone, and for a little while you didn't have to think anymore. You just had to survive. You see him before he even knows you're there, this new kid, this replacement. His uniform is still stiff, the creases sharp, not yet softened by rain and mud and sweat. And his eyes, God, his eyes are so wide, taking in the whole damn nightmare of this place like he's just walked into a bad dream. He's trying to look tough, but the way he holds his rifle, all clumsy and tight, gives him away. I see that look, and it's like a punch to the gut, because I remember it. I remember staring back at my own face in the reflection of a puddle my first day, just as green, just as scared. And I remember Erich, a guy from Hamburg with a laugh that could cut through anything, who saw that look on me and just took me in. He didn't say much, just shoved an extra cigarette my way and showed me how to really lace up my boots so the mud wouldn't suck them right off. Erich bought it outside a village I can't even remember the name of, a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round, and the war just swallowed him up like he was never there. So when I see this kid, this fresh face that still has hope clinging to it like lint, something clicks inside me. A kind of instinct, I guess. You look at him and you just know, with a cold certainty that settles in your bones, that he probably won't last the week. And without even thinking, you decide you're gonna try and change that, just a little. So you sidle up to him, not too close, just lean against the splintered wall of what's left of a barn. "First time up?" You ask, and he jumps a little like you snuck up on him. He nods, can't even get the words out. You offer him a smoke from a crumpled pack, and his hands shake so bad he can barely get it to his lips. That's when you start talking, not like an officer with a map, but like a guy who's learned the hard way. You tell him the things they don't print in the manual, the stuff that keeps your blood inside your body where it belongs. First, you gotta learn to listen. Not to the officers, but to the air. You hear that whistle, that high, thin sound like a tea kettle coming from far away. That's hours outgoing. You can relax a little. But if you hear a sound like fabric ripping, a quick thwip 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 that gets real loud real fast, that's incoming. That's the one that's got your name on it if you're not already pressed into the dirt, kissing the earth like it's your mother. And the dirt, that's your best friend and your worst enemy. When they tell you to dig a foxhole, you dig like your life depends on it, because it does. You dig until your arms burn and your back screams, and then you dig another 6 inches deeper. You think it's deep enough. It's not. A shallow hole is just a grave you dig for yourself before the fighting even starts. Rain will fill it, shrapnel will find it, and you'll be lying in a puddle of cold water and your own fear. Make it deep, make the walls smooth, and for God's sake, don't put your head up when things get quiet. The quiet is when the sniper is looking for a target. And whatever you do, kid, never ever volunteer. Keep your head down, literally and figuratively. The guy who volunteers to run the message back to command or to go fetch water from the stream, he's the one who steps on the mine nobody saw or gets cut down by a machine gun nest they didn't know was there. The heroes in this war are all dead. The ones who are still breathing are the ones who mastered the art of being invisible. It ain't about courage, it's about calculus. A simple, brutal math of survival. You learn to move when everyone else is moving, to freeze when they freeze. You become part of the landscape, another scar on the face of the earth. But those lessons, they're the easy ones. The hard stuff, the real stuff they can't prepare you for, that comes later, usually in the dark, when the shelling has stopped and all you can hear is the moaning. That's when you have to tell him about the smell. You think death is quiet. No, death has a smell. It's a sweet smell, sickly sweet, like rotten fruit left in the sun, mixed with this pungent, coppery odor like old meat. You'll smell it long before you see what's left of the poor bastard it came from. It gets in your clothes, your hair, the back of your throat. You'll taste it on your tongue for days, and no amount of coffee or cheap wine can wash it out. You'll wake up in the middle of the night years from now, if you're lucky enough to have years from now, and you'll swear you can still smell it. It's the perfume of this damned war. And you gotta warn him about the eyes. You'll see it in the guys who've been here too long. Not the new guys, not even the ones who are scared. It's the ones who aren't scared anymore. Their eyes. It's like looking into a window of an empty house. The lights are on, but nobody's home. The fear, the anger, the humanity, it's all been burned out of them. They just go through the motions, hollowed out. That's why you have to build a little shrine inside yourself. A secret place just for you. You think about a girl back home, the way she smiled, the smell of her hair. You remember your mother's cooking, the feel of your bed on a Sunday morning. You hold on to a small thing, a photograph, a smooth stone from a river back home, a letter that's been folded and unfolded so many times the words are starting to fade. You protect that little piece of you like it's the last match in a blizzard. You hide it away from the horror, because if you let the war take that, then you're already one of the emptied ones. You're just waiting for your body to catch up with your soul. Then comes the hardest part, the truth that feels like a betrayal of everything they told us back in basic training. You have to look this kid in the eye, and you have to tell him that the flag, the country, the grand speeches, none of it means a damn thing when the mortars start dropping and the machine guns open up. You're not fighting for the fatherland in that moment. You're not fighting for some general miles behind the lines. You're fighting for the man in the foxhole to your left and the man to your right. You're fighting for Schmidt, who shares his sausage with you even when he's just as hungry. You're fighting for little Klaus, who's only 19 and still writes to his mother every day. That's the only thing that's real. That's the only thing that will keep you from just lying down and letting the darkness take you. The idea of letting them down, of failing the men who are sharing this hell with you, that's 1,000 times worse than any fear of the enemy. Your world shrinks down to the few yards of mud you call your own, and the faces of the men who are sharing it with you. That's your country now. That's your flag. And when you tell him that, when you see that understanding dawn in his eyes, replacing some of the blind terror with a grim, focused clarity, you feel this weight settle on your shoulders. It's a good weight, a terrible weight. Because by giving him this advice, this whispered gift of survival, you've made yourself responsible for him. His life is now tied to yours. You'll watch over him in the next attack. You'll share your water when his canteen runs dry. You'll lie awake listening to his breathing, making sure it's still there. It's a burden, but it's also the only thing that makes any of this bearable. This connection, this raw, human bond forged in filth and fear, is the only thing the war hasn't managed to destroy. In fact, it's the only thing that makes you feel human at all. You look at this kid, this stranger who yesterday was probably sleeping in a clean bed, and you know you take a bullet for him, not because you're a hero, but because he's yours now. He's part of your tiny, miserable, beautiful little family in this wasteland. And that, more than any medal or any victory speech, is the real truth of this war. It's not about winning. It's about making sure the guy next to you gets to see tomorrow.